Thanks for coming. My name is Tim, and my presentation is called Uber, a Culture of Entrepreneurship. So I think everyone here knows what Uber is. I won't belabor that too much. But I want to highlight a few things. So 2019, Uber went public, $82 billion valuation, raised $8 billion for the company. At the time, it was the third highest market cap in IPO history in the US. But I think what I want to focus here is not Uber itself, but what we call kind of the Uber mafia. So the way that I define the Uber mafia is a set of people that have since left the company and have started their own, entrepreneurial ventures. And the reason why this group of people have been so successful, I think it's kind of due to three things that's really prevalent in this network. So these three pillars I call the funding, the human capital, and the ideas. So with funding, people want to, ex-Uber people want to fund ex-Uber people. So they have this access to this pool of capital that's not available to anyone else. You have free flow of ideas, people playing ideas off of each other, challenging each other. And lastly, I think the most important is human capital, right? One of the most important things a founder thinks about is who do I hire for my first team? And I think, the numbers really kind of support that idea that you have this kind of powerful network effects going on. The Uber Mafia has collectively raised $8 billion, founded 185 companies, and have a median funding of 16 million. And a lot of these companies are now household names. So you have Cloud Kitchens, which is founded by TK, Ford, which is a healthcare company, Aurora in self-driving, and then Burr with micromobility. So why do we care about this Uber Mafia idea? So imagine you're an MBA student and your goal is to break into early stage startups. So my conclusion from all the research that I did is that instead of recruiting directly for these startups, a different way of approaching it and a more effective way is to recruit at one of these Uber-esque companies, which will then not only allow you to develop those skills that you need for a startup, but also find the next big founder. So let me just rephrase that another way, right? What qualities made Uber such an effective conduit for future entrepreneurs? And how can aspiring technologists best position themselves to find roles within Uber-esque companies? And if I just break that down, you have kind of three main topics that I try to answer with my research. So number one, is it even true, right? Is there something specific about Uber that made it successful, or are there other confounding factors? If you believe it's true, what is the right company and what is that right role? And then lastly, how do you kind of position yourself to be basically hired for the next big startup? So let me try to answer the first one. I gave you all the statistics in the previous slide, but maybe you think maybe it's a good funding environment. Maybe you had low interest rates. Maybe that's why you're successful. So I took a look at that. Essentially, I found that that was probably not the case. So what I did here was kind of overlaid interest rates historically with some of the big tech IPOs, as well as US seed and angel investments, and found that IPOs occur during high and low interest rate environments, and funding has increased steadily, up until 2021, through the highs and lows of interest rate cycles. So basically concluded that this is probably not a confounding factor. So if you believe this problem statement, then the question becomes, what is the right company and what is the right role for me to target? So I came up with kind of a simple framework here, simple 2x2, but I think really the value is in the X and Y axes. So if you look at the horizontal axis, what is the right company? And then there's this concept of being a categorical innovator. What does that mean exactly? So I spoke with Larry Weber, who's an entrepreneur and a Silicon Valley historian. And a categorical innovator is a company that occurred during notable inflections in history where they came to define an entirely new category. And what that does is it spawns innovators as people build upon the innovations and extrapolate to other adjacent industries. So another way to think about this is, is this company horizontal? Does it cut through different industries? Is it applicable across different industries? As we can see with Uber, it's pretty obvious, right? You have the Uber of X, Uber of flowers, Uber of toilet paper, Uber of real estate. So that's a kind of a very strong example of that. So whether a company is a categorical innovator or not is an important kind of metric to look at. And then on the vertical axis, addressing the question, what is the right role? We want to determine, is this a first hire role or not? So what that means is, there's some research around that interviewed entrepreneurs and asked them basically, what were the first 10 hires in your company? As you can imagine, most of them are engineers, right, as you can expect. But there are a few roles of interest to us MBAs. Those are sales, customer success, data analysts, PMs, marketing, go-to-market, things of that nature. So to give an example, you could be in bucket C if you get a go-to-market role at Yahoo, for example, whereas you maybe want to be in bucket D, maybe a go-to-market role at Google, for example. So if you read my paper, there's different considerations, more detailed considerations, based on like what bucket you kind of fall into. Okay, so now you found the right company, now you find the right role. How do you kind of position yourself to be successful? And I think this to me is kind of the most interesting slide. So I interviewed two Uber mafia folks, people who have since left Uber. One, Singh, who started Scene Health, which is a geriatric care company. Two, Sai, who also left Uber and started Momos, which is a B2B restaurant software company. And I've sort of distilled the 4 key things that they looked for when they left Uber and were looking for their new hires. I think of the left two kind of together, always in scope and many hats. So someone who's not tied down on what their official role is called, and is able to kind of work across multiple functions. So think about a marketing associate who dives into pricing or looks into expansion into different markets. Constant learning, that's something that's pretty obvious and something we do at Tuck, right? Someone who's always curious, always learning. So a good example for me is like if you don't know SQL, you learn SQL by yourself and you learn to access data. That's important to the company. And then lastly, just be useful, right? So identifying the people that you want to align yourselves to, those potential entrepreneurs, and finding problems that they're dealing with, they don't have enough bandwidth or time to solve, and then solving those problems for them. So that's kind of a powerful piece of advice. So in conclusion, what I wanted to do was create kind of a very practical guide for kind of MBA type students to break into early stage startups. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Tim. This was interesting. My understanding is that, like, especially under Kalanick, Uber has like a really notoriously bad culture. Did you do any research on how that like played into the success of all these people that spun out of that culture, or like any of those, I guess, like org norms that might have played into this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the Uber under TK is a very different Uber under Dara, the current CEO. And I think a lot of the people that left, especially, people who had the most windfall from the IPO, were from the TK era. And a lot of people will attribute their success to like, move quickly, break things, growth at all cost mentality. So I think that's kind of a superpower that some people believe they have. It could also be like a potential pitfall, right? So one of the things that in my interviews, people have mentioned is like, people who come from Uber tend to think that they're invincible because they've had kind of unlimited resources. They could fail all the time and still have a job. So not having that financial discipline has been the downfall for a lot of companies. So I think both a good thing and a bad thing, potentially.
So you talked about having the Uber Mafia network being a really good place to find entrepreneurs. What about, from the perspective of the audience, like an MBA looking for a company, what would they need to do to find the sources of capital as well? Or are you kind of assuming that the entrepreneurs that they find will have already found the capital?
Yeah, so my assumption is that through the Uber Mafia, the network, the founders that have left Uber will tap into that Uber network to basically get their funding. And you kind of see that play out with the people that I interviewed. I think both of them, like their first rounds were from Uber affiliated people. So I think separately from like the advice to MBA students, like the focus should just be on like, how do I find the right people? How do I prepare myself better to get into that startup position, as opposed to like looking for capital.
Thanks, Tim. This is awesome. I'm wondering if there's like a timing effect. Do you feel like a few years after IPO, there's a lot more kind of cash flowing around, the people who left may feel most connected to the company? And I'm wondering, like, let's say someone joined Uber today, would they still be able to make that shift? So I guess my question would be like, do you think the effect diminishes over time or it sort of holds constant?
Yeah, absolutely. I think now is certainly like too late for Uber at least. I think for timing, it's hard to time it exactly because when you need like 1 or 2 years to work at the company and then build up credibility, right? And then two, I think if you're able to time like liquidity events successfully, like you should be an investor, not a employee. But generally I would say like a big jump in valuation from like private round to private round, that's a good indication of an inflection point. And ideally like a few years before they publicly say like, hey, this is the year that we want to go IPO is kind of the ideal sweet spot for me. Cool, thank you.